The story of Iran and Israel is often told as if it were inevitable, as though hostility between the two states stretches back into distant history. In reality, the origins of their relationship are far more recent, shaped not by ancient divisions, but by the political transformations of the 20th century. To understand how this rivalry emerged, it is necessary to begin in a period when the two were not enemies at all. For much of its modern history, Iran stood somewhat apart from the central conflicts that defined the Arab world. Its identity, language, and political traditions were distinct, and while it shared religious and cultural connections with the broader region, it was not directly involved in the early confrontations over Palestine. Jewish communities had lived in Persian lands for centuries, forming one of the oldest continuous Jewish populations in the world. These communities existed within the structures of Persian society, experiencing periods of stability alongside moments of tension, but never becoming the focus of major geopolitical disputes. When the State of Israel was established in 1948, the Middle East entered a new phase of conflict. Many neighboring Arab countries rejected the creation of Israel outright and went to war. Iran, however, responded differently. It voted against the United Nations partition plan that proposed dividing Palestine, aligning itself formally with opposition to the plan. Yet unlike Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and others, Iran did not participate in the war that followed. Its position remained cautious, shaped more by diplomatic calculation than by direct confrontation. This cautious approach would evolve into something more deliberate in the decades that followed. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran pursued a foreign policy that aligned closely with Western powers, particularly the United States. The Shah viewed modernization and international integration as essential to Iran's future, and this perspective shaped his approach to regional politics. Israel itself, closely tied to Western alliances, emerged as a natural, if discreet, partner. By the 1950s and 1960s, a quiet relationship had taken shape. It was not openly celebrated, nor was it formalized in the way that many diplomatic relationships are, but it was nonetheless real and significant. Iran supplied Israel with oil at a time when access to energy resources was a critical concern for the young state. In return, Israel provided technical expertise, particularly in agriculture and infrastructure, areas that aligned with the Shah's ambitions for rapid development. Beyond economics, there was also a shared strategic outlook. Both Iran and Israel viewed the rise of Arab nationalism with concern, especially under leaders such as Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. For Israel, Arab nationalism often translated into direct military threat. For Iran, it represented a political movement that could challenge its regional position. This overlap in interests created space for cooperation in intelligence and security, with both countries seeking to monitor developments in a rapidly changing Middle East. This alignment formed part of a broader pattern, sometimes described as Israel's effort to build relationships with non-Arab states on a periphery of the region. Iran, with its size, resources, and strategic location, became one of the most important elements of this approach. The relationship was pragmatic rather than ideological, based on shared interests rather than shared identity. Yet beneath this cooperation, deeper forces were beginning to take shape within Iran itself. The Shah's rule, while marked by economic growth and modernization, also faced growing criticism. Political opposition, economic inequality, and dissatisfaction with the regime's close ties to Western powers all contributed to rising unrest. By the late 1970s, these pressures had reached a breaking point. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 transformed the country in ways that extended far beyond its borders. The monarchy was overthrown and replaced by an Islamic Republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This new political system was founded on a different set of principles, rejecting the Shah's alignment with the West and redefining Iran's place in the world. Within this new framework, Israel was no longer seen as a distant or pragmatic partner. Instead, it was recast as a symbol of what the revolution opposed. The new leadership framed Israel as an extension of Western influence in the region and as an entity that stood in opposition to the interests of Muslim populations. This shift was not simply rhetoric. It was reflected in immediate and concrete actions. Diplomatic ties were severed. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed and handed over to representatives aligned with the Palestinian cause. Public statements from Iran's leadership emphasized a commitment to opposing Israel, embedding this stance into the identity of the new state. What had once been a quiet partnership was replaced almost overnight by open hostility. This moment marked a clear dividing line in the history of Iran and Israel. Before 1979, their relationship had been defined by caution, pragmatism, and limited cooperation. After the revolution, it entered an entirely different phase, shaped by ideology, regional competition, and an emerging pattern of confrontation. The transformation was not the result of gradual drift, but of sudden rupture. It set the stage for everything that followed, from indirect conflict in distant arenas to the more visible tensions of later decades. Understanding this shift is essential because it reveals that the rivalry between Iran and Israel is not rooted in ancient history, but in the dramatic political changes of the modern era. The years immediately following the Iranian Revolution did not begin with direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. Instead, they unfolded in the shadow of another conflict that would shape the region for nearly a decade. In 1980, Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, beginning a long and devastating war that consumed the attention and resources of the newly formed Islamic Republic. For Iran, survival became the overriding priority. Yet, even during this period, the relationship with Israel remained present, though in unexpected ways. Publicly, Iran's leadership continued to denounce Israel in strong terms, reinforcing the ideological shift that had followed the revolution. But the strategic realities of the Iran-Iraq War introduced complexities that did not always align with public rhetoric. Iraq was widely seen as a common threat, not only by Iran, but also by Israel, which viewed Saddam Hussein's ambitions with deep concern. In this context, limited and indirect interactions took place. Israel, seeking to prevent an Iraqi victory that could alter the regional balance, was involved in efforts that indirectly supported Iran, particularly in the early years of the war. These interactions were not the basis of renewed cooperation, but they illustrated the layered nature of Middle Eastern geopolitics, where ideological hostility and strategic calculation could exist side by side. As the war withdrew to a close in 1988, Iran emerged weakened but not defeated. The experience of prolonged conflict reinforced the leadership's emphasis on self-reliance and regional influence. It also marked the beginning of a more structured approach to extending Iran's reach beyond its borders, not through direct confrontation, but through alliances and partnerships with non-state actors. Lebanon became the central stage for this new approach. In the early 1980s, amid the instability created by civil war and foreign intervention, a new group began to take shape. Supported by Iran, Hezbollah grew from a small network into a significant political and military force. Its primary objective was to resist Israeli presence in southern Lebanon, where Israeli forces had intervened in 1982. For Iran, Hezbollah represented more than a local ally. It became a model for how influence could be projected without direct military engagement. Through funding, training, and ideological alignment, Iran was able to establish a presence in a region far from its own borders. For Israel, Hezbollah quickly emerged as one of the most persistent and capable adversaries it faced. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, this pattern of indirect confrontation became more defined. Clashes between Israel and Hezbollah continued, particularly in southern Lebanon, creating a cycle of action and response that shaped the security environment along Israel's northern border. This was not a conventional war between states, but it was no less consequential. It marked the beginning of what would later be described as a long-running proxy conflict. At the same time, the broader regional context was changing. The end of the Cold War altered global alignments, and new diplomatic efforts emerged in the Middle East. In the early 1990s, Israel entered into negotiations with Palestinian representatives, leading to agreements that were seen by many as a step toward resolving one of the region's central disputes. Iran viewed these developments with skepticism and opposition. From its perspective, the agreements did not adequately address the underlying issues of displacement and sovereignty. This divergence further deepened the gap between Iran and Israel, moving their relationship beyond the immediate dynamics of Lebanon into a wider political and ideological divide. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, another issue began to take center stage, one that would come to define the next phase of the rivalry. Iran's nuclear program, which had roots in earlier decades, became the focus of increasing international attention. While Iran maintained that its activities were for peaceful purposes, concerns grew, particularly in Israel, about the possibility that the program could lead to the development of nuclear weapons. For Israel, this was not simply another strategic concern. It was framed as a potential existential threat. The prospect of a hostile state acquiring nuclear capability introduced a level of risk that went beyond conventional military considerations. As a result, the issue of Iran's nuclear program became central to Israeli security planning and international diplomacy. At the same time, Iran's regional influence continued to expand. The 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States created new opportunities for Iran to build connections within Iraqi political and security structures. In Lebanon, Hezbollah had become deeply entrenched, both as a military force and as a political actor. In Gaza, Iran developed relationships with groups that opposed Israel, further extending the reach of its influence. Israel responded to these developments through a combination of strategies. Intelligence operations became increasingly important, focusing on monitoring and, where possible, disrupting Iran's activities. Reports of covert actions, cyber operations, and targeted efforts to slow the progress of the nuclear program began to surface, though often without official confirmation. By the early 21st century, the relationship between Iran and Israel had evolved into a complex and sustained rivalry. It was no longer defined by a single event or issue, but by a network of interconnected concerns. Proxy conflicts, ideological differences, and strategic competition all played a role, creating a situation in which tensions were constant, even in the absence of direct war. This phase of the relationship laid the groundwork for what would come next. The lines of confrontation had been drawn across multiple arenas, and the stakes had risen significantly. What began as a shift in ideology after 1979 had, over the course of 2 decades, developed into one of the most intricate and enduring rivalries in the region. By the early 2010s, the long-running rivalry between Iran and Israel entered a new and more volatile phase. For decades, confrontation had been shaped largely through distance, carried out in Lebanon through intelligence networks or within political arenas. That distance began to narrow with the outbreak of the Syrian Civil War in 2011, a conflict that would redraw the strategic map of the region. Syria, long an important ally of Iran, became a critical point in Tehran's regional strategy. As the Syrian government faced armed opposition, Iran moved to support it, deploying military advisors, coordinating allied forces, and strengthening its presence across the country. This was not only about preserving an ally, it was also about maintaining a corridor of influence that stretched far from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon. For Israel, these developments were deeply concerning. The expansion of Iranian presence so close to its borders altered the balance that had defined earlier decades. What had once been a distant rivalry now appeared at Israel's doorstep. In response, Israel adopted a more active military posture. Airstrikes targeting Iranian positions and supply routes in Syria became a regular feature of the conflict. These operations were designed to prevent the transfer of advanced weapons to Hezbollah and to limit Iran's ability to establish a permanent military foothold. This period marked a subtle but important shift. While both sides continued to avoid full-scale war, the frequency and visibility of direct interactions increased. The line between indirect and direct confrontation began to blur. Incidents that might once have remained hidden were now part of a more open pattern of engagement. At the same time, the nuclear issue remained a central pillar of tension. International negotiations sought to address concerns about Iran's nuclear program, leading to agreements that temporarily eased some pressures. Yet these arrangements did not resolve the underlying mistrust. Israel continued to view the program as a potential threat, while Iran maintained its position that its nuclear activities were within its rights. This unresolved issue added a persistent layer of uncertainty to an already complex relationship. As the decade progressed, the tools of confrontation expanded. Cyber operations, intelligence activities, and targeted strikes became increasingly important. This was a form of conflict that did not always fit traditional definitions of war. Yet it carries real consequences. Each side sought to limit the other's capabilities while avoiding actions that might trigger a broader escalation. Moving into the 2020s, the pattern began to shift once more. The accumulation of tensions, combined with changing regional dynamics, led to more direct forms of engagement. Incidents involving missile strikes and overt military exchanges signaled a departure from the earlier emphasis on proxies alone, while still limited in scale. These actions indicated a willingness to confront each other more openly. Despite this escalation, restraint has remained a defining feature. Both Iran and Israel operate within a regional environment that includes powerful external actors and sensitive economic lines, particularly those linked to global energy supply. The risks associated with a full-scale conflict extend far beyond the immediate region, influencing international markets and security arrangements. This broader context acts as a constraint even as tensions rise. At its core, the conflict continues to be driven by a combination of ideology and security concerns. Iran's leadership frames its opposition to Israel as part of its broader worldview, rooted in the principles that emerged after the revolution. Israel, in turn, views Iran's actions, particularly its regional alliances and military capabilities, as a direct challenge to its security. These perspectives reinforce each other, creating a cycle in which actions are interpreted through the lens of long-standing suspicion. Looking back across the decades, the evolution of this relationship reveals a clear trajectory. What began as cautious distance gave way to quiet cooperation, then to abrupt rupture, and finally to sustained rivalry.